Hey everyone, welcome back. This lecture is going to talk about why we forget and what that looks like, and perhaps some causes for forgetting. Everyone forgets. It just happens. That's okay. We will also talk about perhaps some more severe instances of why we may not be able to get information out of our long term memory. Our last lecture was about retrieval, getting that information out. What happens when things go wrong? That's the point for today. So we're going to start with this idea of when we have competing information and how that may impact whether or not we can recall or recognize information. So imagine that you have a really long grocery list. And let's say you've got 20 items on your grocery list. You forgot your pen. You don't have a phone. You're just trying to remember all of the items on your list. Well, what we have found through research is that you are much more likely to remember the first couple things on that list and the last couple things on that list while forgetting all the stuff in the middle. And what we call that is the serial position effect. Think cereal as being linear, not the cereal like you forgot to pick up the Frosted Flakes. So, items at the beginning and end of the list are easier to remember than those in the middle. The serial position effect itself can be broken down into two main parts. If you go into an office and you meet a bunch of people for the very first time, you may remember the first couple of people you meet because it's at the beginning. It's what we call the primacy effect. They're the first ones, your brain is fresh, and so you remember the first, two or three people that you meet. Keep meeting people. Now your brain's starting to fill up, you're getting a little overwhelmed, and then the very last person you meet that day, you might remember that person as well. It's the recency effect. It was right there at the end, and so it's fresh, it's recent. But all those people you met throughout the day that were in the middle, you're much more likely to forget those because they're in the middle. And this is one of those reasons why I highly recommend note cards. I recommend note cards because what can happen is when students just study their notebook, they remember the first page of their notes pretty well because it's the first thing they read over and over and over again. And they remember the last page because it's the last thing that they read before they put their notebook away for the night. But with note cards, there's no beginning, there's no middle, and there's no end. You can just shuffle up your note cards. And that's good. That helps with memory retention because you aren't memorizing things in any particular order. Note cards help us eliminate the serial position effect by getting rid of the primacy effect and recency effect. So why else do we forget? Well, in our last lecture, I talked about the idea of a memory trace, this series of cells that fire in a particular order, and then that is how we remember things. But memory's weird, right? I talk about these memory systems like sensory, short term, and long term, and it seems like we have memories that are kind of in between. Like, imagine you go to a Royals game and you go and you park at Kauffman, and there are tens of thousands of cars there. Well, you need to remember where you parked. So it's got to be, and you need to be able to remember that hours later when the game is over. So it's clearly not going to be in our short term memory. We want it to be in our long term memory. But the reality is, it doesn't need to be there forever. So what can happen is you form this memory trace of where you parked your car, right? You encode that information into your long-term memory because it is important. You maybe come up with some kind of mnemonic. You look at the sign and you think of a way to help you remember where it is you park. And you keep that memory for a few hours, for as long as you need it for the game. When it's time to find your car, that memory trace fires. There's my car. You drive off the lot. And the reality is, you probably never use that memory trace again, so it decays. It goes away. That series of cells that was firing in a unique pattern, it breaks up. Our last lecture, I gave the analogy of walking through the woods, right? Well, maybe you walk through the woods 2 or 3 times, you've kind of formed this path, but eventually you've gotten where you need to go and you don't need to walk through the woods anymore. Well, at some point, that path will start to overgrow once again. Sometimes when we're trying to remember, we have a hard time and we forget because competing memories are getting in the way. They're interfering. And there's two main types of memory interference, what we call proactive and retroactive interference. Proactive interference, what happens here is old information, previously learned information, is getting in the way of you learning something new. Maybe you get a new cell phone, and with it, a new cell phone number. And when you're trying to tell people your new cell phone number, you're having a hard time remembering it because the only thing you can remember is your old cell phone number. That's what we call proactive interference. The old information keeps getting in the way with you trying to remember something new. We also have retroactive interference, which is the exact opposite. Retroactive interference is when new information is interfering with your ability to remember something older, right? So maybe you have a new locker combination. Well, you're probably going to struggle to remember last year's locker combination because you have this new one that you have memorized. They're very similar memories. They get in the way of each other. And so if you can't remember your locker combination from last year because the only thing you can remember is this year, that's retroactive interference. Retroactive, the new information is getting in the way of remembering something old. Prospective memories are kind of weird. The best way I can try to explain prospective memories is to first talk about its opposite, which is retrospective memories. Retrospective memories are memories for things that have already occurred, right? So your birthday last year, your first day of school this year, those are all retrospective memories. They are things that have already happened. Prospective memories are memories for things that haven't happened yet. What? Prospective memories are your memory to do stuff. So if you need to remember to take out the trash tonight, if you need to remember to pick up your sister from dance class, those are prospective memories. They are your memories to do things. And we often forget prospective memories because we don't have any memory cues. We have to create memory cues, which is why if we need to remember to do something, it's really important that we write it down. We put a reminder in our phone. We tie a string around our finger. We have to create some kind of cue. Otherwise, prospective memories are really easy to forget. And then the last bullet point I have up here is what we call motivated forgetting. Motivated forgetting, we're not going to go into too much detail today, but the idea behind it has a lot to do with psychoanalytic theory and your unconscious mind. And according to psychoanalytics, if something is really troubling, if something is depressing to think about, we may be motivated to forget it. We may intentionally forget that information because we don't like thinking about it. So maybe there's that person who wasn't very nice to you a couple years ago in school. Over time, you may be more likely to forget those events than perhaps the happier times in your life. So that's the idea of motivated forgetting, that we push out the memories that are troubling to us. So we're going to end today talking about a couple different types of amnesia. Now, I'm going to back it up here. Everyone forgets, right? That's a very normal process of memory. What you're about to see doesn't happen to everyone. Amnesia is when a memory should be recalled, but you can't for some reason. So it's not an issue with just encoding failure, with maybe you just didn't encode the information correctly. This is when, no, you should have this memory, but now you don't. So a couple different types of amnesia. The type on this slide are going to be what we call structural amnesia. And when I say structural, I mean something physically has happened to your brain to prevent you from remembering. Maybe it was a brain tumor, or in this case, a car accident. So you have someone who's driving along, they get into a really bad car accident. Well, perhaps a result is what we call retrograde amnesia. With retrograde amnesia, it's like someone wipes the hard drive off of your computer. It's like it erases the past. Retro, think the past, right? Retrograde amnesia is when you have that accident and you can't remember anything up until that accident. You don't know who you are, where you're from, who your family is. Now, the other type of amnesia, kind of an interesting form of structural amnesia, is what we call anterograde amnesia. And with anterograde amnesia, we see damage to the hippocampus, right? And that's what helps us form memories. So you're driving along, have that car accident, and with anterograde amnesia, you can't form any new memories. your last memories are of the things leading up to that accident. So you know who you are, you know what you do for a living, where you're from, who your friends are, but you can't form anything new. If you think about the Atkinson-Shiffrin memory model, it's like it stops at short-term memory. The ability to encode information into long-term memory is what is hindered with anterograde amnesia. Now, these are forms of structural amnesia. There's a physical cause. Something is wrong with the brain. We could see it under a brain scan. But what's really fascinating and what we're going to end with today is this other type of amnesia, this other category of amnesia that's not structural, but is what we call functional amnesia. And functional amnesia would fall under this category of mental health disorders that we call dissociative disorders. Dissociative, to dissociate or to disconnect. And you may ask yourself, well, what is being disconnected? Well, with dissociative disorders, what is being disconnected is a person's sense of self with who they are, with their memories, their feelings, their thoughts. There's a disconnect between me as a physical human, a physical being, and my mind, and what makes me who I am, what makes me Mr. Harmon. Those two things are disconnected. And there are a number of different types of dissociative disorders. Dissociative amnesia, the symptoms of dissociative amnesia, I'm going to listen carefully here. These symptoms look no different than retrograde amnesia. You don't know who you are, where you're from, who your family is, what you do for a living, right? The symptoms of dissociative amnesia are the same as retrograde amnesia. The difference is there's no physical cause. The difference is it's mental, it's functional. I have there with or without fugue. There are some people who experience dissociative amnesia, and for one reason or another, it's somewhat inexplainable. They travel, they leave. And so you might have someone who lives in Kansas City, and then all of a sudden it's 3 weeks later and they're looking around and they're in the middle of Denver, Colorado. They don't know who they are. They don't know how they got there. That's dissociative amnesia with fugue. Think fugitive is someone who flees, someone who runs. Depersonalization disorder is a really interesting type of dissociative disorder where there is this detachment from the person's physical body and their mind in regard to they feel almost as if they are having an out-of-body experience. Depersonalization disorder, people describe it often as if they are hovering over their own body, that they are watching themselves in third person. So there's this disconnect, again, between the physical body and the sense of self. And then the final one that I have there is what we call dissociative identity disorder, a very severe dissociative disorder. You have maybe heard of this before under its previous name. This used to be called multiple personality disorder. Up through the DSM-3, it was called multiple personality disorder. They changed the name with the DSM-4 to dissociative identity disorder. And with dissociative identity disorder, you have a person who we would consider, let's say, the host. And that person experiences multiple different identities. And they transition from, I'm Mr. Harmon, I'm in my mid-30s, I'm a high school teacher, I'm married, I got a couple kids. And then transition to different identities. They may have different names, they may have different memories, they may have different personalities. And the theory behind this is that perhaps my past has been so troubling that memories of my past would inhibit me from living a normal life. So to protect myself, to protect the host, I have created these alternative identities that shift back and forth between the host and the alternatives. Now, if this slide is having you scratch your head and you're saying this is kind of a difficult thing to understand, I get you. Dissociative disorders can be quite complex to really wrap your mind around. I would highly encourage that you read your textbook to get kind of a better understanding of what these look like. What we have found is that there's an incredibly strong association between dissociative disorders and people who experience trauma as children. It's no guarantee, but there's a strong correlation between the two. So incredibly traumatic past can lead to some people dissociating. As far as treatment is concerned, one big element of treatment is attempting to have people recognize that an alternative cannot coexist with the host. Seems kind of weird, but hear me out here. Imagine that I have this alternative identity that believes I'm 10 years old and my name is Matthew, and I have these really troubling memories of being a child. Well, if I was meeting with a therapist during that session I believed that was Matthew, that therapist would try to remind me, like, hey, I didn't know you when you're 10 years old. I didn't know you at that time. I didn't know these things about you. I know you now. And so we try to essentially bring the alternate identities together with the host themselves. Now, we're going to talk about this more in detail in class. And so come with your questions, because I welcome them. And it's possible that when it's all done, we'll all end up with more questions than we have answers. But my hope is that this was somewhat helpful for you to understand functional amnesia, what it kind of looks like, and how it's different from structural amnesia as well. As always, write down those questions, send them to me in email, bring them to class, and good luck, everyone.